Hey folks, Clay Novak here, flying solo tonight, hosting the Elsa show with Clay Novak. I got a good show for you tonight, running by myself, but we'll see what happens. Okay, you asked, I sent out a note this week across the social medias and asked for input, topics you guys wanted me to talk about, wanted me to run my mouth about, or wanted my opinion on. And I got a whole host of things. So, of course, Israel, probably top of everybody's mind, conflict with Hamas. I got a little bit talking about the border, had a few requests to talk about Ukraine, and even had a request to talk about Iran. And thinking about all that, and all the requests from all of you out there, it occurred to me that these singular topics can't be taken as an individual. Sure, I could give you my opinion on each of them. I could probably give you a little bit of background on each of them. But the reality is that none of these, and this is the conclusion I came to, and really what I'm going to talk about tonight, is these topics can't be taken by themselves. They are so interconnected and intertwined. And truthfully, everything that's going on in the world today is intertwined, that you can't take them as a singular event. So we're going to do a little bit of background. I got some notes here just to keep myself on track, make sure I hit all the points I want to hit. But, we're going to go back a little bit of history. And one of the things that we're going to talk about, first off, is, it's all connected. And we as Americans have a horrible habit, in my opinion, of sitting back and forming an opinion based on a couple of things. One, based on media input. And your opinion is going to be formed by whatever media you subscribe to, left-leaning, right-leaning. There's very few that are central and very few that provide just basic news now with the opportunity for the viewer or listener to determine their own outcome or their own opinion based on just facts being reported. Very few news outlets just do facts anymore. So what you get is editorialized news, and that obviously is going to skew your opinion. We all sit on our couches in the safety of our homes here in America and form opinions, having no real experience or exposure for the most part to the things that are going on in the world. I know I'm an oddity, and I know that a lot of my peers are an oddity. Over the last 20 years, a bunch of us had a ton of experience in the Middle East, but that is less than 0.5% of the U.S. population has served in an ongoing conflict, specifically as it relates to terror in Iraq or Afghanistan. So while we sit home, we watch the news, we read the newspapers, maybe we read a few books, very, very few people actually have diplomatic experience. Very few people have military experience. And without that, really what you've got is academia with no practicum, truthfully. So while you may have read books on the history of the Cold War, or the history of Israel, or the history of whatever, if you haven't been there, smelled it, tasted it, or really interacted with it, then your opinion is not fully formed. You're missing a very, very important part. So we're going to go back in time a little bit, and it's really relevant because, again, we can't take anything out of context. So, post-World War II started the Cold War. And the Cold War specifically, the Western Bloc, U.S., NATO alliance versus the old Soviet bloc, Warsaw Pact nations, right? And it's really all the old Soviet satellites that pre-existed. And really we fought a bunch of proxy wars within that Cold War, very small, hot wars within the bigger Cold War, because the ultimate threat was the, Russian tanks, Soviet tanks through the Fulda Gap into Europe, which culminated in a global thermonuclear war, which nobody wanted. But we as the United States and as the NATO nations were trying to, suppress communism globally. The communists obviously were trying to expand. So there were a lot of things that happened. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis. We had a whole bunch of proxy wars. The Iran-Iraq war was a proxy war. You had obviously things going on in Africa in smaller numbers and truthfully handled by a lot of NATO nations. But you had things going on in Southeast Asia. You had the Korean War, which was, a bit of a proxy war, with the U.S. and UN forces fighting against North Korean communism, backed by Chinese communism, with even backed by Soviet communism. Fast forward a few years, same thing going on in Vietnam. You had the United States with a few allies, the Aussies and some others, fighting against North Korean NVA, backed by the Chinese, backed by the Soviets, etc. So there's a lot of proxy war stuff going on, and that's relevant to today because we are rolling back into that. I'm going to touch on this more in a little bit, but we're rolling back into the Cold War mentality because we have to. So, beyond the Cold War, post 1989, we all remember President Reagan, Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall, and that was really, kind of the beginning of the end of the Cold War. But at the same time, if you back up about 10 years, actually not 10 years, really, about 10 years or so, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, we stuck our toe into what evolved into the global war on terror. So while the Cold War was going on and we were prioritizing, keeping communism at bay, we dipped our toe through a proxy war into what became the global war on terrorism. So we backed the Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan through the Central Intelligence Agency, and we backed them with equipment and training and some agents on the ground, and we helped them fight the Soviets. So no major commitment by U.S. forces, no U.S. forces in Afghanistan, but we gave them Stinger missiles, which was a huge tide turning in the fight between the Mujahideen, the Afghan fighters, and the invading Soviets. But that really is kind of where we got involved in the greater Muslim world, us personally in the United States, and that expanded. Fast forward 4 years from then to 1983. And really, we just hit it. It was just yesterday, the anniversary, 40 years of the Beirut bombing, Marine barracks. And that was really where terrorism hit home for the United States in a very real way. And then fast forward again, right? We had numerous incidents over the following decades. We had, the first bombing of the World Trade Center. Some people have actually forgotten about that. Some people actually don't even know about that. But the truck bomb in the basement, we had the bombing of the coal, and then, obviously 9/11 played into that. And that is when we declared it to be a global war on terrorism. And why is that significant? Because it is global. And truthfully, it started in Afghanistan post 9/11 as we held Al-Qaeda, responsible, and by proxy, the Taliban for giving them harborage. We initiated a very hot war against terror and terrorism. And then that expanded. So fast forward a couple of years, 2003, we went into Iraq, WMDs. That was a very conventional fight for a very short period of time, devolved very, very quickly into, a war against an insurgency. Was that terrorism? On the surface, you could call insurgency terrorism. They were terrorizing the Iraqi public. I was there, saw it happening. That was a terroristic war. It was a methodology of fighting by a number of organizations in Iraq. So we continued to fight that, right, for the last 20 years or so. And then obviously a couple of years ago, we left Afghanistan. So the misnomer is that the war on terrorism ended 2 years ago because we left Afghanistan. And the reality is it hasn't, never did. But, again, I got some notes here because I want to make sure I hit all of this. But, there are some things that are important in all of this and how it's very, very interconnected. I mentioned Iraq. When I was in Iraq in Baghdad, and this was really the war had been going on for a while, I was in Baghdad, eastern Baghdad, and in our sector, we encountered on a semi-regular basis a faction of Hezbollah. A lot of people kind of turn their head at that and they say, well, what was Hezbollah doing in Iraq? Well, they were fighting Americans. Americans. They were taking the opportunity as a terrorist organization to target Americans. That's what they were doing. And that's what all of these terrorist organizations do. So, the global war on terror, again, didn't end, 2 years ago when we left Afghanistan. And it continues globally, not just affecting the United States, but affecting the West and non-Muslim nations. Okay. Let's talk about Israel very quickly. If you take what's currently going on in Israel, the Israel-Hamas conflict that's going on, I know that, Netanyahu, declared war against Hamas, and I understand that. And a lot of people are saying, well, this is a war. And I even saw today that we're counting days. I think today's day 18 of the war between Israel and Hamas. But it is a much smaller war as a part of a much larger war, which is the global war on terror. Terror organizations continue to fight. They don't have an end date, and it's not regional. It's not localized. It is a global conflict that they are waging against Western non-Muslim nations, period. And I'm not saying it's Muslim people. I'm talking about Muslim Islamic extremist organizations, Hamas, Hezbollah, all factions, ISIS, all factions, Al-Qaeda still exists to this day, Taliban government in Afghanistan, right? And they're being backed by conventional nations such as Iran, right? And now the Taliban government in Afghanistan to continue these fights against the United States, right? So, Israel itself has been under siege. The Israelis, the Israeli people, the tribes of Israel have been under siege, have been persecuted and attacked for going back 3,000 years. And they've always had a home, right, in Israel, specifically in and around Jerusalem. That's acknowledged through history. If you don't want to acknowledge that, you should probably go back and read the Bible. It's all kind of captured in there, if not the history books. But the tribes of Israel, the Israelites and modern day Israelis have been, persecuted by numerous, armies and governments, the Romans. There's been a number of different, invading armies, to include the Christian Catholics, right? The Persians, all the way up to and including, persecution by the Nazis. And that's what got us to 1948 and the establishment of Israel as a nation, as decided by the United Nations, right? This was not an imposition on a Palestine as a country. There was no Palestine as a country, right? This was the establishment of Israel. Palestinian people are Muslims that live there. But this was not Palestine taken away from Israel. But what you've got is the creation of an anti-Israel, contingent that has evolved and grown into the modern day Hamas terror organization. Okay. Again, intertwined with everything else that's going on. So, we understand after 20 years of fighting terrorism that is the most difficult type of warfare. Guerrilla warfare, as fought, as a great example in Vietnam, is guerrilla warfare. Very, very difficult to do. Terrorism is a completely different ballgame. It's not just guerrilla warfare. It's fought in a guerrilla style, but they are terrorizing. They're not just focusing on military targets. They're not just focusing on a military enemy, which the Viet Cong were very much doing in Vietnam. They were focused on fighting Americans in a somewhat organized fashion, but in a guerrilla style. Terrorism is very different. Terrorist organizations target civilians specifically, although they do target also military targets, but they target civilians specifically to instill fear and therefore gain control. They're trying to manipulate, they're trying to control. It's about power, and that's what they do. They target those who cannot protect themselves in the most heinous ways possible, which is what's going on between Hamas and Israel. Okay, we've seen it. That Hamas has been capturing families, killing children, killing women. There's been torture, beheadings, all kinds of things. These are all terror tactics specifically aimed at creating fear to, drive that terror, which provides them the control that they want. And really what they're looking to do is to get someone like Israel or the United States or any Western nation to capitulate and give them what they want to make the terror stop. That's the goal. So, the end state for Hamas, at least on the surface, is to continue to attack in a terror fashion, to terrorize the Israeli civilian populace so that they are given the land that they feel that they deserve. Will it stop there? Probably not. What they will want is, and what they've stated out loud is, they want all of Israel gone. The Israeli people, they want them gone. They want the country of Israel gone. They want all of it. It's not just Gaza. It's not just, any Golan Heights or anything else, any other little enclave that exists in Israel right now. It's about getting rid of Israel. Extermination, very much on the level of the Nazis. They want the Israelis gone. Jews gone completely. They don't want them in the region. They don't want them in the area. They want that piece of land. And they're going to fight with a terror tactic to do it. So again, that's what they're doing. And, so we've talked about, the Cold War and our evolution from a Cold War into the modern day terror war. And so now, though, we're moving backwards a little bit in time. There are new Cold Wars evolving, and actually some continuation of some other older Cold Wars that really never, the embers never really went out. So where are these new Cold Wars happening, right? Obviously, the one at the top of everybody's mind in a Cold War fashion is the Ukraine. We, the United States, are not fighting Russia. That is not a hot war for the United States. Is it a hot war in the Ukraine? Of course it is. For us as the United States, that is much more of a proxy war as a part of a larger Cold War between United States and the new Russia under Putin. Okay. It is a Cold War. We are not fighting Russia directly, haven't, and trying to avoid it at all costs. Where else have we got Cold Wars going on? We got Cold Wars going on, continuing to go on between, us and China, focused in and around Taiwan. We run through the straits, they run through the straits. They fly some planes over Taiwan, we fly planes over Taiwan. Nobody has shot at each other, but we are posturing and trying to present power or protection, in our case for Taiwan, to prevent an all-out war. It is a Cold War that's going on between us and China. Additionally, Korea, North versus South. For those of you that don't know, that war actually never ended. They signed that there was no end of conflict signed between North and South Korea. That conflict is still active to them, but shots haven't been fired in decades, truthfully. We, as still occupying, or not occupying, wrong word, but being present as a UN force, right, an American force inside of South Korea, supporting the South Korean military forces, we contribute to that Cold War. We all know, whatever president, President Trump, the little fat guy in North Korea, all of that. They present a presence. They're not going anywhere. They haven't invaded South Korea as many times as they threatened. South Korea is in a defensive posture. That is a Cold War that continues to exist on the Korean Peninsula. And then, we as the U.S. rely on a number of allies in these Cold Wars because we are not the ones, standing alone by ourselves. We've got NATO, right? And I continue to say this out loud. I think that Ukraine cannot be a U.S. problem and a U.S. problem only. It has to be a NATO problem. We've got the UN, which plays a role still in South Korea, North Korea conflict, and then we've got a series of alliances in the Pacific, the Australians, the New Zealanders, and they keep really, truthfully, that Pacific Rim, kind of in check. Nobody steps out of line, and that kind of bleeds over into China as well. So we've got Cold War's going on in the past, kind of ended in and around 1989. Around 1979, and really into 1983, we had the war on terror start to ramp up a little bit, and then continued on and continues on to this day. What else did we have going on? Well, go back to President Reagan, right? There was a war on drugs, and again, whether people know it or not, that was a very small, but at times a very hot war. There were multiple joint task forces, U.S. along with some South American, Central American nations that conducted operations to truthfully, fight the drug cartels, back decades ago. And who are they fighting? They're fighting the cartels that manufacture, that distribute, and that sell large amounts of drugs, right? I'm not talking about the street corner guy. I'm talking about the distribution of kilos and containers and thousands of pounds of drugs being distributed and then sold, before it gets to the guy on the street corner within the United States. And you could even tie that back into the war on terror, because one of the major, producers of poppy, which is then made into heroin, was coming out of Afghanistan. So if you think the global war on terror had nothing to do with the war on drugs, you're not connecting the dots, which again is kind of my point to this conversation this evening. So, who is involved in the war on drugs? We did have military involved. No question about it. It's been documented. It's not a secret. It's not classified. But really, for the United States, who's fighting the war on drugs is federal and local law enforcement. Really more federal, because local law enforcement's more worried about the guy selling on the street corner, or maybe the tier above that, drug dealer. But federal law enforcement, ATF, now Border Patrol, DEA, they are committed to, prevention of drugs in the United States, especially in large quantities, because it is illegal. So they're committed to that. So that's a law enforcement fight inside the continental United States and really in and around our borders. Now, our borders are a whole different topic. And again, intertwined with the war on drugs, but also now the war on terror. So I know a lot of people don't want to hear about this because they're sick of hearing about it. Some people don't even believe it's true, but our borders are open borders, because they are open borders. I was stationed in El Paso for 2 years. I could look right into Ciudad Juarez. The borders are open. People come across all the time. It happens. They actually move through, saw evidence personally of people moving through Fort Bliss, Texas. Illegal immigrants using training facilities on Fort Bliss, Texas, as stopover points, as shelter as they move through the desert in the middle of the night. It happens. There are people moving across the border. But what does that do? Obviously facilitates the drug cartels, right? They use the border. And when I say the border, I'm talking from, southern tip of California all the way down to, southern tip of Texas, right? They're using the entire border to move drugs across. Is it just there? Of course not. Ports of entry, they move by sea. They use, truthfully, submarines. They use boats. They use airplanes. They use any means that they can to come across into the United States, across our borders, our boundaries, not just borders, not physical borders of land, but our boundaries, international borders, to come into the United States, to bring their product in to continue to make money. There's also a massive amount of human trafficking that goes on across our borders and across those same boundaries. And honestly, probably almost as lucrative as drugs. People don't understand the business that is involved with moving people across our open borders. Most immigrants can't make it from wherever they're coming from all the way into northern Mexico and then make it across the border, because they don't know where they're walking. They don't know where they're going. They don't know the best places to cross. They don't know how to get them. They traffic themselves. They pay to have themselves trafficked into the United States. If they get caught, they lose the money. They're back in Mexico. Well, maybe they're not. But, if they go back to Mexico, then they've got to pay again to make another attempt to get into the United States, because they haven't come from, somewhere in Central America or even somewhere in northern South America all the way through Mexico to get to the border, to fail once and go, nope, I'm going home. So they pay, they try again. But they're paying to traffic themselves. And as a part of that, people are being trafficked. Kidnapped children, kidnapped women, truthfully, even kidnapped men are being trafficked across that southern border by people who do this professionally. They're called coyotes if you've never heard it before, but that's what they do. They move people across the border. Sometimes it's just immigrants, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's people for sale are being moved across our borders, and they move into, when they get to the United States, they're sold into, prostitution, sex trafficking. They're sold as slave labor. There's all kinds of things that happen to these people, horrific things, truthfully, that happen. And it's being paid for. It's human trafficking. That happens across our southern border. Terror groups are also exploiting that very open southern border. And I know this for a fact. You can read it in the news, but they have caught a number of people on the terror watch list coming across our open borders in the South. It's happening, right? It's infiltration by the terror groups that I talked about. So again, old Cold War, new Cold Wars, global war on terror continuing into today, right? It didn't stop 2 years ago when we left Afghanistan. Those terror groups still exist, and they're still fighting a war against the West, non-Muslim nations, specifically the United States, right? And they're using our southern border to cross into the United States for a number of reasons, right? Who's fighting this right now? It's federal law enforcement. So not only are they fighting the war on drugs, right, but they're also fighting against anyone coming across the border, the human trafficking part of it, the infiltration part of it, right? This is, again, Border Patrol. This is DEA. This is FBI. This is ATF. They're all involved with trying to stop the infiltration across the southern border. We have dedicated a decent number of assets and even established a headquarters, an intelligence gathering organization called the EPIC, the El Paso Intelligence Center. I visited there a couple of times. It's an amazing organization, multinational, multi-service, joint military, interagency. They've got federal law enforcement there. They actually have international federal law enforcement there, to include federales from Mexico operating there. And what do? They watch our borders. And I'm not just talking the southern one. I know it's stationed in El Paso. I got it. It's proximity. But they also watch the northern Canadian border. They collect intelligence on that. Every port of entry coming into the United States, right? And that those are everywhere. Ports of entry are not just what you think of as LA, San Diego, Miami, New York, Seattle. They're everywhere. There are multiple ports of entry into the United States. They monitor that. Airports, international airports, right? They monitor traffic there. But they do spend a lot of effort monitoring ground traffic coming into the United States across the southern border with Mexico. And again, joint interagency, multinational, they're all trying to combat this. Assets allocated, right? Some of them even being, at times, military aircraft, military drones in a non-offensive posture. All they're doing is detection, intelligence gathering. But again, law enforcement committed to this. So that's a lot. They're already committed to that. Why are those terror organizations coming across the border into the United States? A couple of reasons. One is to establish themselves, to create the potential for a terror threat within the United States. They're also intelligence gathering, right? Which brings me to the point of espionage. We think of espionage as, James Bond, right? Or maybe, The Good Shepherd, if you're a movie fan, which is a great movie, by the way. But we think of espionage in those terms, right? Spies, dark corners, and those kinds of things. That espionage is ongoing, and it's continuous, and it goes, truthfully, global. So you've got, think back to the old Soviet bloc, right? East Germany, East Berlin, West Germany, West Berlin, the old Soviets, us, British with MI6. There's other organizations out there. That espionage continues it happened back then, but it continues now, right? If you think that the Russians aren't conducting espionage against the United States, you're fooling yourself. In the modern world, Russia versus the old Soviets, still KGB, whatever they're calling it now, that still exists very much like our CIA still exists, and we're still conducting espionage around the world. Iran conducts espionage, right? They are. They're spying on us. They are using that southern border to get into the United States to collect intelligence on the United States. It's a thing. It's real. Don't fool yourself into saying it's not happening because it is. Pakistan. I will tell you that in the 3 tours that I spent in Afghanistan, one of the biggest causes of stress and truthfully things that we shouldn't have had to worry about, that we did have to worry about, was being spied on by Pakistani intelligence, spying on the United States while they were also helping us against the Taliban. So with one hand, helping us against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, because they truthfully in a lot of places in Pakistan didn't want them there either. But at the same time, collecting on the United States and our forces in Afghanistan all the while. That's espionage. They were doing it. They were spying. Happening, right? China. We know, there's been American politicians that have been, fallen to Chinese spies. Documented. We all know what's going on, right? It happens. Espionage continuing to this day, right? Terror groups continue to spy on the United States, and they do it on U.S. forces that are forward deployed, but they're also using that southern border. And oh, by the way, conventional methods, right? We all know the 9/11 hijackers were in the United States well before 9/11. If you think that hasn't continued to happen since 9/11, again, you're fooling yourself. Those terror organizations have people in the United States, and they continue to collect intelligence. They're conducting espionage against the United States. So again, Cold Wars, right? Old Cold Wars, espionage going on there, proxy wars going on there. Then we fall into, what was the global, or is the global war on terror that continues? 1979, really big event, 1983 in Beirut. We have the reemergence of Cold Wars, right? Or the continuation of some Cold Wars and emergence of new Cold Wars. All the while, we're fighting the war against drugs, 1980s, Reagan era, and then all the way into, present time. Same time, we've got espionage going on, right? The United States has had to protect itself from being spied upon, right? From various nations around the world. And so it's very easy for all of us as we get bits and pieces of this, and it's reported in the news, and then, to get distracted by shiny objects. And then there's a new shiny object, right? So, right now you've got, even in the last 10 years, let me just read off some things, right? You got Syria, Ukraine, North Korea, Taiwan. You've got terrorism globally, Russia, China, U.S. elections, civil unrest within the United States, politics, current administration, previous administration. You've got the trial of President Trump. You've got the Hunter Biden stuff. There's a lot of shiny objects out there that distract the American public and, truthfully, the American government from focusing on some of these other threats that are continuing and ongoing. So what does that do? Well, not only are we all watching these things going on, but the rest of the world is watching. Everybody watches what's going on in the United States. Every nation on earth, they all watch what's going on in the United States, because our elections and what goes on here affects the rest of the globe. It's all intertwined, right? China cares who's in the White House. Russia cares who's in the White House. Terror groups care who's in the White House, but they also care where we are focusing our efforts, right? If we're focusing our efforts politically, economically, militarily in one place, then that creates opportunities in other places, right? So nothing is independent, and everything that's going on is an opportunity for someone else. It's easy for us to say we should go to Ukraine and fight Ukraine. We should go into Israel, help Israel fight Hamas. Okay, as a singular incident, maybe you could argue that. As a singular issue, if that was the only thing going on in the world, then yes, the United States could and possibly should get involved in some of these. But they're not. They're not the only thing going on in the world. We have to continue to worry about China. We have to continue to worry about Russia. We have to continue to worry about terror organizations. We have to continue to worry about any of the next thing, North Korea, whatever pops up, Taiwan, unrest in South America, Venezuela going to hell in a handbasket, whatever it is. We have to focus multiple places. We can't commit in large numbers, in militarily or in dollars, into every single thing that pops up. We can't do it. We can't afford it. We don't have the ability. It's not there. Right. So we do need those alliances. Some of them I've talked about already. NATO is huge. And this is, again, why I continue to say that the Ukraine-Russia conflict needs to be a NATO problem. The U.S. can't foot the bill. We can't commit as much as everybody wants us to Ukraine, because it's not the only thing going on. NATO needs to chip in, right? So United Nations, right? They could take some of the weight off of the North Korea thing if they chose to. Now, they've done a lot, some of it good, some of it really bad. They've done a lot in places like Africa, specifically Africa, a lot of Africa, where they've gotten involved. They've done some in the Balkans when Yugoslavia fell apart, and you got all of the new Baltic nations, or really the reemergence of the old Baltic nations, Croatia, Bosnia, those kind of places. The UN has been involved in small pieces and parts as peacekeeping forces, but they're international forces that present a presence that the U.S. doesn't have to do, and it doesn't have to do it by itself. The UN is important. It's not a great organization, but it does take some of the weight off of us. We've utilized alliances like this over the last 20 years. ISAF, which was the multinational, I think we were up to, at one point, 32 nations contributing in Afghanistan. 32 nations, right? Now, was it the U.S. the bulk of it? Sure, we were. Did every little bit help? Yeah, absolutely. We had, NATO and non-NATO allies contributing. We had Muslim nations contributing in Afghanistan, things that we needed, right? That was a globally identified threat and important to the world, that Afghanistan, was stabilized. And truthfully, we used an alliance there under the ISAF banner that was helpful. It brought everything together to take some of the weight off of the United States. We had MNCI, I think it was called, Multinational Core Iraq, which again, U.S., Brits, other nations, was an alliance that contributed there. And then we've got multiple joint task forces around the world, anti-terrorism task forces around the world that we've continued to use to take some of this weight off the United States. It's important. And why is it important? Well, let me tell you, really, shared cost and shared responsibility, right? We can't do all of this on our own. I've said it before. I'll continue to say it, but we need to know, and it's truthfully, there's some limiting factors in there. What are these other nations capable of? What are they capable of contributing? What are they willing to contribute? And what do they get in return? Listen, being a member of NATO is profitable for a number of nations, profitable to their military. A lot of their military stuff is funded because they are part of NATO. There's NATO money that gets back to them. If they contribute to a NATO mission, they get money and they get equipment as part of that. I've seen it happen. I've literally seen NATO nations show up to an operation almost empty-handed. And to get them operational, the NATO headquarters says, well, buy them this and get them that, and they need 4 of those, and just give it to them so they can be operational and they can contribute. And then they take all that stuff home with them. It happens all the time. It's not uncommon. So, those alliances are great because they take weight off the United States, and we need them, and we need more of them, but we need them to be valid. We need them to contribute. We need more nations to be able to contribute on a level that the United States contributes. And I'll be honest with you, the number of nations that can do that are rapidly going down. And anywhere near the capability that we can is going down even quicker. And as an example, I think I talked about this on the last show with Elsa. I think the British Navy is down to maybe 1 aircraft carrier at the most, and they may be down to 0. Okay. The German army is incapable of fighting against Russia. 1989, when President Reagan stood there at the wall and told Gorbachev to tear it down. The German army was ready and capable and professional and equipped, and they were ready to go to war to defend Germany. That army doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't. It is, fallen into disrepair. The level of funding is gone. There's just not a lot there for them to be able to contribute anymore. Plus, you've got a little bit of global fatigue, and Afghanistan contributed to that. There's a lot of nations that spent 20 years, or maybe even 15 of those 20 years, or maybe 12 of those 20 years contributing over and over and over again, and they got tired. Their armies are small. Their contributions were small, but they still had a great, great impact. And there is fatigue associated with that. So, where are we at now? We talked about Cold Wars, and we talked about proxy wars, but we also talked about the U.S. role and kind of what we do. And a little bit of clarity between what we do in a proxy war and then what we do in support, because we keep talking about Israel, and how we need to support them, and we talk about Ukraine and how we need to support them, versus really kind of how we would more handle a proxy role versus an actual direct support role. So, in a proxy, we're going to provide some equipment, we're going to provide some ammunition, maybe some logistics, and probably in modern warfare, a whole bunch of contractors. You're probably going to get a bunch of American military contractors that are going to contribute, whether it's in logistics, in maintenance, in a direct action role, security role. There's a lot of ways that contractors can contribute, but none of it's going to have an American flag on it. None of it. Okay. And that, again, keeps us from having to commit U.S. forces to another fight, which is what, we're trying to avoid when we're in this proxy role, or we're kind of sitting behind the scenes in a proxy type war. If we're in a support role, which is what people continue to say about both Ukraine and Israel, there's American flags all over the place. We provide aircraft, direct, attack aircraft support in a lot of cases. Drones, unmanned aircraft, all right, UAVs in both an attack role, but also in an intelligence gathering role. Other intelligence assets, we've got radio intercept and, satellites and all kinds of other things that we can collect intelligence and then provide it to, somebody like Ukraine or somebody like Israel, right? We have the best tech when it comes to that kind of stuff, and we can help them out. We traditionally provide medical assets in these when we're in a supporting role. And that's one of the things that, when we started to leave Iraq and we started to leave Afghanistan, they were very concerned about losing our air support, but also losing our medical capabilities, because they can't replicate that. We have the best combat care that there is on the planet. And that's not something that you can just throw in place if you don't have the backbone and really the people to do it. Our Navy provides a lot of support. We've talked about China. We've talked about Taiwan. Presence matters, right? Nobody wants to go toe to toe, at least not right now, with an American, carrier group. We just parked 2 of them off of Israel. Got a whole bunch of aircraft there, but we also got a whole bunch of ships with Tomahawk missiles on them, right? We have a direct fire, indirect fire, cruise missile capability. And then we would have direct logistics in a supporting role where we would provide, ammunition, we would provide repair parts, we would provide all those things, but it would be more in a direct role. Fly it in ourselves, drop it off, fly it back out again, or drop it with U.S. aircraft very overtly. We're not trying to be secret about it. And then in the end, you've also still got American contractors involved, right? So it's very important when you talk about how we support a conflict, whether you're talking about us in a direct supporting role or in a proxy role. And really, where all of that kind of comes to a head is our defense industry. War is expensive, okay? And we have chosen to go to a high-tech route. And every time that we commit assets to help, especially in multiple places, those are assets that we can't commit to something that we're doing. So, our reflex is to get more of them, right? If we only have, let's throw out a number. If we only have 50 of a piece of equipment, right? Let's say a drone. Say we have 50 drones and we want to commit, 10 of them to support Israel. And then we've got another 7 supported to Ukraine. But we've also got, 10 more committed to Korea. And then we've got another half a dozen committed to Taiwan, and then we've got, on our southern border, we've got another 3 or 4. We're starting to run out of drones, right? So what do? We buy more, we get more, okay? Plus we upgrade, tech gets better, we replace old with new. There's only so much, lifespan on pieces of equipment. So, we every time we commit those, it's expensive. And then again, it goes back to the alliances. What can the other countries contribute on a like level with a like capability that takes some of the weight off of us? It would be really, really nice if, NATO could provide a drone fleet to match what the United States has, and then just commit that to the Ukraine, and we don't have to. Right? I mean, that would be nice. That would be less we would have to do. South Korea, maybe they don't have to use American equipment at all, American intelligence assets, American whatever. It's just Korean stuff. Then we don't have to commit to it. We don't have to spend the money. But truthfully, then it costs them money. And again, war is expensive, and defense contractors are really expensive, right? And again, we went tech versus mass. The old Soviets decided to buy a whole bunch, like a lot of very cheap equipment, where we went with a much smaller number and a much higher technical capability. Fast forward, about 70 years, and now it's starting to come around that our tech has gotten so expensive that we can't replace in kind. We crash an F-22, and we're out $100 million or whatever they cost. And that's, we're not talking crashing first generation jets, right? We're talking, there's only however many there are in the Air Force. And if you lose one, it's not like losing, a Korea, era jet where we had 7,000 of them in the Air Force. We're talking a couple of hundred, and they're, 500 times the cost. So our tech, while it's great and it gives us distinct advantages in a lot of places, it's very, very expensive. And, that the Russians are they're buying cheap stuff. They're developing technology. They're buying cheap stuff, and they're still making a lot of it, and they're still down that road, and they can continue to replace things that get blown up or get destroyed, or move a bunch of them around where they need them to, where we can't. We have very limited numbers, right? But we do have the best assets in the world right now. But we do have a near peer that's catching us, and that's China. And they've gone combination of what we've done and what the Soviets have done. So they've gone high tech, but they also have high numbers. And we truthfully are being a little bit hamstrung by our defense contractors because we let them. We pay for all of their R&D. When you hear things like, well, it's $700 for a hammer, well, that's because, the R&D, that led up to, buying that hammer cost thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. And for that defense contractor to make that money back, they overcharge. They charge the U.S. government money to recoup their R&D fees, or they even get the R&D fees up front. It probably doesn't cost $100 million per copy of an F-22. It probably costs a lot less than that, but they probably spent, $3 billion in R&D that they need to recoup. But we allow them to do that. We allow them to overcharge. We allow them to recoup that R&D because it is that expensive. And we have gone down that road of allowing them to do so. Now, that's a little bit of you could get into a very deep discussion about who's involved with defense contracting and where our politicians are at, and who's getting paid. But the reality is it's becoming prohibitive for us to do the things that we need to do as a nation because our defense is so expensive. And it's because our defense contractors and the defense industry is so expensive, and we allow them to be. So again, my point to all of this is that this stuff is all very intertwined. You've got, old Cold Wars that have continued, some of them. You've got the war on terror. that continues. You've got the war on drugs that continues. You've got new Cold Wars, new proxy wars that are coming up. You've got a global, a threat in a new global power in China that continues to grow. I won't even say emerge because they're here. And they've got their own agenda. There's a lot of things that we've got to address as the United States. But we can't address everything, and we can't address everything equally. Okay? We can't address every threat, and there's a number of reasons why. One, I mean, I've talked about a lot of these already. Our military is too small in both people and in numbers of equipment. Federal law enforcement is too small to do everything that they're continuing to do in the volume that they're continuing to do it in. Our current laws, politics, and policies restrict a lot of this stuff for good reason. We have, we can't commit U.S. active military forces inside the borders of the United States. That goes all the way back to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Like, the British house soldiers in American homes. We don't want to replicate that. And that's why we don't, we have limitations on what the U.S. military can do inside the U.S. borders. Our tech is too expensive. Frankly, public opinion won't allow us to get involved in some of this stuff. And I'm okay with that because really, some of this stuff is none of our business. Honestly, some of us, we don't need to get involved. Again, I keep harping on the NATO-Ukraine thing, but Ukraine at this point, less of a problem. Really, less of a problem. Do we want to stop Russia from expanding? Yes, of course we do. Do we need to get directly involved to do that? No, we don't. The Ukrainians are actually doing a pretty good job. NATO needs to put this as one of their top priorities. There's the U.S., it's really less of our business than something that's a little bit closer to home, right? Well, we have to prioritize our people, our assets, because we don't have enough to do everything. It's just not there. The well is running dry. Okay. So I encourage everybody, to kind of think through all of the things that I talked about, when a singular issue comes up, right? When the next Israel comes up, when the next Ukraine comes up, when the next thing like that happens, take it in the context of everything else that's going on. You can't just say, well, I support Israel. You can't, right? Or we should commit forces to help Israel. Okay, well, where are we going to get them from? And what are we going to prioritize Israel over? And I'll tell you, honestly, if you support in any way, shape, or form Hamas, you are supporting global terror. Not just Hamas and not just, the Palestinian people. If you support Hamas in any way at all, you are supporting the global terror network that exists. If you support one, you support them all because they're all interconnected, all of them. We've already seen, American weapons from Afghanistan through the Taliban government have made their way to, Hamas in Israel. It's happening. Iran is backing Hamas. They also backed a number of terrorist organizations when I was in Iraq, right? They're all interconnected and they're all intertwined. Oh, by the way, you've got, multiple facets of ISIS out there. You've got multiple organizations, under the flag of Hezbollah out there. If you support one, you support all of them. You can't just say, well, I support Hamas because they're Palestinian and they just want Palestine back. No, that's not how it works. It's one, it's all of them. And we have American politicians that are outwardly supporting Hamas. And it's crazy because they are supporting terrorism, period. So please think through this stuff before you take a position, right? And don't be swayed necessarily by one media source. Don't be swayed by one media report, for crying out loud. I know if you're at MSNBC, you hate watching Fox. If you're Fox, you hate watching CNN. You don't want to hear the other side of it, but all of us have to look beyond what our normal news feed is. And you've got to educate yourself. And oh, by the way, there's an entire generation of veterans out there who have looked this stuff in the eye, been very, very close to this in proximity when it comes to the execution of this stuff. Talk to them, ask them, right? Ask them what they know, add it to what you know. Don't take what they say as gospel. Don't take what I say as gospel. Okay. I'm one guy. But if you talk to them, take it in the context of what you have learned, what you've heard, what the media has given you, what you've read, the books that you've read, right? If you don't have your own experience base, you've never been to the Middle East, you've never interacted with any of this, or you've never been to Europe, Eastern Europe, right? As it relates to, Russia and Ukraine, if you've never been down to the southern border, whether it's Tijuana or Juarez or any of these other places, if you've never seen that stuff, talk to somebody who has, take that into account. Firsthand accounts matter, and it helps you take a more informed position than just saying, well, I know the history of X. I know the history of, the Korean conflict. I know the history of, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I read it. Yeah. Okay. That's great. It's in a book, and anybody who wrote a book, it's biased. Okay. So you've got to take multiple, that's normal education, right? It's normal adult education, educating yourself, taking information in from all over the place and making an informed decision, and history matters. Okay. So that's kind of my point for tonight. I can't believe I went an hour. We are approaching an hour right now. It's been, I like having Elsa around. It's a great break. It's somebody that I love going back and forth with, and we provide each other some great context. And I thank her for the opportunity to do this, to fill in for her this week on her hiatus. Given an opportunity and me sitting here by myself, there's a couple of organizations that I just want to mention. One of them is the Alan Lynch Foundation. I'm wearing one of their shirts right now. Al's a personal friend. He's a Medal of Honor recipient from Vietnam. His foundation, the Lynch Foundation, does a ton for veterans, based out of Illinois, but they do a ton of work for veterans all over the place, specifically education and some other things. But it's a great organization. Check them out. The Mend the Heart Foundation, which is associated with another organization called Lazy Lab Hunt Club, another pro-veteran, veteran-run, actually active duty run organization that does some veteran service stuff. They use outdoor therapy to help veterans as they transition. A great organization. Phantom Airborne Brigade, which I'm a part of, a bunch of old paratroopers who get together. And again, it's a veteran service style organization that we use the brotherhood of jumping out of planes and our lives as paratroopers to kind of help guys, as they transition. We do some great things for some veterans. We have a couple of paraplegic, triplegic, multiple limb amputees who jump out of airplanes with us because, it helps them. It helps them, kind of live their life and get the most out of their life. And it's a great organization. So that's, again, Phantom Airborne Brigade. A couple of great organizations out there, too, that I'm associated with. Refuge Medical. If you're one of those people like me, carries a first aid kit everywhere you go, Refuge Medical, I recommend you check them out. Condition 1 cases, they make some great, if you need anything that needs a hard case, cameras, guns, whatever it is, they make some great hard cases. You can check them out. That's Condition 1 cases. And then lastly is a good friend of mine, runs the Black Swamp Coffee Company, Bill Edgar. They make the coffee that has my name on it. Keep moving, keep shooting. I've got a couple of brands of coffee, and that all comes from Bill. So I recommend you check them out as well. So again, just taking an opportunity to kind of round out the hour, but those are some organizations that I'm associated with, and some great companies run by some great people, some great Americans who are doing a lot of awesome things for our veteran community across the board. So thanks again, everybody, for listening to me run my mouth for an hour. Thanks again to my partner, Elsa, for giving me the opportunity. I love you. And we will see everybody next week. And as always, from me, check out the book. Keep moving, keep shooting. It's a mantra, but it's a great book, and it's my product, and I put my name behind it, and everybody loves it. So give it a read if you get an opportunity. Thanks, everybody, and see you next week.